Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Good to have everybody here. Good to see your mostly smiling faces. There we go. Now they're smiling. And good to be learning together again. And just like that, it seems like we just started this book yesterday, and we're almost a third of the way through, done with part one after today. So we'll be discussing the last chapter in part one, aka The Struggle. Always an uplifting way to start a book by or a chapter by titling it The Struggle. But before we dive in, anybody have any preliminary thoughts, comments, reactions to the writing? Lisa and then Margaret. I saw you guys first. So.
Okay, so I've been listening with interest over the past the past parts of this section, as different people have said, oh, this is where I feel resonates with me, and this is where it really speaks to me. And up until this point, like no place totally spoke to me. And I guess it's this chapter that really does speak to me, because I feel like this is where I live my life. I like to say that I live in the gray areas, that I don't live a black and white life. So, that my philosophy about life is that I'm always sort of, you know, figuring things out, and nothing is all one way or all the other way. I'm kind of always muddling around in the murky gray areas. And so this chapter really made sense to me because I never really linked it up to, you know, um, Jacob's struggle with man God, um, and how struggle, it made me feel like, oh, like this struggle is a Jewish thing, that the way I live my life is actually like a Jewish thing. And and it really kind of makes sense for me because, first of all, I found myself struggling where you said, when you said figure out like where you belong. I keep going back and forth between like sort of progressive evolutionary and kind of one and kind of the other. And um, I was raised in a reform temple, but after my marriage, I belonged to a conservative temple. My father was raised Orthodox. My mother was raised very reform. So, yeah, so this whole idea of struggle really resonates with me.
Excellent. As I like to tell people, there's a reason we're called Bnei Yisrael and not Bnei Yaakov, right? We usually aren't identified as the children of Jacob. We're identified as the children of Israel, the descendants of the one who wrestled. And that's kind of our job. And that's, I think, the argument he makes here, too, is that wherever you are, whatever it is, it's the fact that you're wrestling in the first place that really defines you as Jewish.
Right, and I forgot to say, I guess the maybe the most important thing is I wrestle with, like, sometimes I think there is a God, and sometimes I'm not so sure. So I'm constantly wrestling with that meta question as well.
Excellent. Margaret?
And I agree with Lisa. I found this the most interesting chapter so far. Since I have begun to take Judaism seriously, the whole idea of that whole Jacob thing and the wrestling has been, for me, the kind of key um, thing to think about. But the other thing that what I liked, and I guess I've thought about it in terms of wrestling with the existence of God, or wrestling in the sense that, for example, like Abraham being able to argue with God as being a kind of specifically Jewish thing. But the other thing that interested me particularly in this chapter was the way in which he breaks down what wrestling means to various of the category that he has identified, because those are things that I haven't really thought about before and not really quite understood in the way that he describes them before.
Excellent. We can circle back to that maybe in a little bit as well. What that means and what it means in the different views of us wrestling. But TK.
Okay, sorry about the dogs barking in the beginning. I agree with what Lisa said. I thought it was very interesting that the thing that lumps the diversity of what is a Jew together, he decides is wrestling and struggling. And I have kind of two comments about it. One is there seems to be some confusion in the Jacob story about prevailing. And in my mind, Jacob prevailed, not that he bested God, the angel, whatever it was, but that he hung in there and he kept struggling. And so that to me is kind of the message is, you know, with all that we've been through in history, including the Holocaust, including the Inquisition, including everything, we're still here. We're still struggling with all of it. The other thought I had was, okay, if that defines what a Jew is, you can't say that other people in other religions don't ever struggle with God. And so if you take that logically, what that means is when they do, are they Jews as they do it?
Yeah, I did have that thought as well. That if a Catholic is wrestling with the idea of Jesus as the Messiah and as the Son of God, does that make them Jewish? Because they're wrestling with it. Or a Muslim, whatever religion. Does that make them Jewish because they're wrestling with it? Other comments before I kind of launch out.
I have one.
Yeah.
One thing that this made me think about is going back to, I felt like I was 13 years old again because I quit going to temple because when I went, all I heard was everybody argued everything down to the infinite point, not the finite point. It was just one side of the aisle versus the other, like at least once a month on any subject that came up. So I think it's important with young people to to educate them and let them understand that it's normal for you to question what you've been taught, and it's normal for you to discuss these issues with your parents in a respectful way and not agree with them.
Yeah, my father tells a story along that same line where he said the Shabbat services in his synagogue growing up used to take forever because what would happen is the Torah reader would make a mistake and the gabbai would correct them, and then somebody in the congregation goes, "No, no, no, that's not how you pronounce it," and then somebody else would go, "No, no, you're wrong," and then it would devolve into a debate in the congregation about the word, and then they finally settle back down, and then 5 minutes later it would happen again, and the gabbai would correct him and be like, "No, no, 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 that's wrong," and so so it used to take forever. Stuart.
Well, one topic or issue that wasn't addressed in this particular chapter, though has been addressed in other chapters, was the whole issue of women in Judaism. And I continue to struggle, although I've heard the women in our group here, I've heard their own reactions and feelings about that. But I still, in my perfect world of Judaism, I would have women being exactly equal to men. Responsibility up on the bima, the authority in the synagogue, etc., everything. And I think there is room for, in my perfect world, for women to to say I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to take care of the children. I'm going to take care of the house. But I think, in my view, conceptually, they should be 100% equal, and that certainly includes at the rabbi level. And there was a discussion in a previous chapter about that, and women rabbis, I think, feeling discriminated against, in at least in their congregation in Judaism. So I'd really, again, like to hear the women in our group today give their feelings about where they sit. 'Cause I know that we're going to talk about the traditionalists and the evolutionists and the progressives, et cetera. But for me, whichever one we individually might want to feel like we will go with, I think in my reality, I think it has to be one that has equal for women and men in Judaism.
So I want to respond to that for a moment, and not to disagree with you, because I don't, but I think part of Feldman's larger question for you is, that's great that you believe that. Why do you believe that?
I think,
How do you come to that conclusion?
well, it's like the Declaration of Independence, I mean, it is self-evident to me. It is self-evident that women are equal to men. And I don't think you have to define that. I think it is just evident. And the opposite is why can't we agree that women are equal to men in Judaism?
Well, no, I think the reason I'm asking is because your answer to that question helps align you with which of these groups that you kind of fall into. So,
Yeah.
in some sense, the answer you gave, at least, whether you identify this way or not, is kind of a progressive answer to it. That this is the way that the world is reacting now. This is the way it is. It's self-evident that in this world, that men and women should be inherently equal, and therefore the law should be fitting that criteria. And that's kind of what I want to, as much as we can debate the details of each of these worldviews, as Feldman calls them. A little bit of what I want to do today is also make sure that we're reflecting on our answers so that we know, because our answers might help us align and figure out where we are in that question as well. Diane, I saw your hand up before.
Okay, I was just going to address the earlier issue because you talked about the dissension in the synagogue. So once I was an adult, my mother said to me, she said, when you were growing up, we never discussed any dissension in the synagogue because we wanted you to feel really good about being there. And so we didn't want to talk about people who were leaders that acted out, and we just didn't say anything. And so, I mean, each household, they figure out how to tell the story, but that's the background that I came from. And Stuart, I really appreciate your remarks, because for me personally, Howard and I belonged to Knesset Israel the first 10 years we were married, and it worked for us at that time. But once I came to Bethel and I realized how many capable women were allowed to participate, I was just overwhelmed with disappointment and frustration that so many organizations in the Jewish world quiet those voices. It's a travesty. There's no question about it. And I mean, even if you go back to saying, okay, women are equal in our synagogue, but when you read the Torah and you read the story of Miriam, from whom there would not be a Passover if it hadn't been for her. She was courageous. The men were not. Her dad was not. So forth and so on. So I don't know how we retell those stories, but it is still a bone of contention with me, and it prevents me from feeling very comfortable around those traditionalists who say to me, "Oh, well, we respect women 10 times more. In our community, a woman has 10 times the honor that a man does." So my response is, well, if that's the case, then if I go to Midian, I'm a woman, I could have it all by myself, right? We don't need any men there because I count as 10. There, there, there's not an easy answer to it, but it's been painful for me, and I'm amongst the older ones here, so I've seen it, a long history of it. When I had a bat mitzvah, it was on Friday night. I got to recite the Shema and give a speech, and that was the whole ceremony.
Margaret.
You kind of challenged Stuart, and he said that he felt that it was self-evident. But I think there's also in the Torah, it says that it doesn't say men are created in God's image. It says people are created in God's image. So I think that that's the response that I would give to your challenge.
So I think that's a great response too. I just want to point out that the difference is that Stuart's response, and this is not a criticism of Stuart in any way, but Stuart's response is, it's obvious, like the Declaration of Independence, that we're all created equal. So women should be created equal as well. Which is, as I said, like that's kind of a progressive argument that in our view, in our society, it's self-evident that men and women should be equal. So therefore, the law should reflect that. Your response is almost more of an evolutionist response, which is that, yes, we see that we kind of know in our society that men and women are created equal, and we can ground that in the tradition and show it in the tradition of that's the case. So again, not arguing by any means, but my point in the question was more to kind of discern how, and I think that's what Feldman's trying to ask us to do too, is say, okay, when we're answering these questions, the role of women, the role of law, the role of ritual, the way we think about, the way we answer these questions sheds a light into the worldview we have. And as he's going, I'm assuming at least, as he's going to show, it's going to have an effect on other issues in Jewish life today as well, and how we respond to those answers as well. So sometimes the way we think about the process and the way we think about the answer is as much a answer as the actual answer is. Barbara, I saw your hand up before and then you put it down, so I just wanted to see if you still had a...
I was going to just compliment Stuart on allowing a woman who is a traditionalist to be able to do what she wanted. In his explanation, he said they are free to do, or he believes that his beliefs don't have to apply to everyone, that the women can choose. So I appreciated that. And when he said, not that I want to behave that way, I don't want to be told, go sit over there, you're a woman. So don't sit with your son. So
and
whatever.
Agreed. And I think it's important for us egalitarian inclined people to recognize that even though women might not have a ritual role in traditionalist communities, they don't always feel left out by not having that role. And I think part of the question is, how do the women in those communities feel about it? And do they feel as if they are being silenced or not being able to do things or feeling held back? Some of them might, some of them do, and some of them might. Some of them feel very honored, very privileged, and very happy in what the life that they're leading. Um, so I just want us to keep that in mind as well, along Barbara's line. Cindy, you had your hand up too.
So, while I enjoy the freedoms for women in our synagogue, I mean, I have davened, I have read Torah, I have not been denied anything that I have wanted to do. I want to take what you said and what I think Feldman has said, that it is yes, we are entitled to see our Judaism in our way, but we are also required to not think of anybody as a bad Jew, which means that to judge others who are Jews because they don't agree with how we practice our Judaism, I think is one of the main points that he's working, I don't know, towards or working against judgment. Laying out that these are the possibilities and laying out that this, there is a place for you, but there is a place for everybody else. And it's not up to me if somebody else has chosen to practice or express their Judaism in a different way. And I mean, I grew up, in a pretty traditional conservative kind of, I mean, it's that those are the old things. But I grew up with a mother who taught in an Orthodox Jewish day school. And so let me just back up and I'm going to cut this short. Let's be respectful of how everybody else sees their Judaism, and let's not try and put shoulds on other people.
Beautifully said. And, in that sense, pointing out Barbara's compliment of Stuart, you can be take a progressive view of it and say it's self-evident. Like, of course, women are equal, and therefore they have the right to choose what life they're going to live. And if they're content in that life, then, good. They should be happy in that life. But not to impose our perspectives onto others. Yes.
Unfortunately, I think it goes beyond just women. I think that people who view a hierarchy of we do more mitzvot than you on a daily basis, therefore we're better Jews than you. So this may be something that Cindy is clearly or not so clearly having in her mind as she's talking about it, but that comes to me that I don't like it when people say, oh, you're only conservative, you're not XYZ, not as good as me.
Well, yes, the argument goes in all directions, right? Like, as a progressive if you're a progressive who feels very strongly in egalitarianism, I think Feldman is warning against judging too strongly the traditionalists who disagree, and trying to point out that there is a beautiful, valid part of the way that they're doing things. And on the flip, and that, yes, it goes the other way too, that, for the traditionalists saying, well, we're more observant, we do more mitzvot, so you're less Jewish because of what you're doing, is also not a good call. And anyone saying to the godless that you're less or not really Jewish because you're wrestling with your faith in God is also equally problematic, as is the godless Jews' argument back of you're primitive because you do believe in God and these traditions. So yes, I think broadly what Cindy was saying is it goes in all directions. That can we find a way as Jews to respect each other's worldviews wherever they may be, as a valid expression of Judaism, and that all of us are struggling with the belief and the faith and wrestling with God. And as long as we're doing that,
Always.
we're living authentically Jewish lives. One more comment from Barbara, because she had her hand up, and then I want to switch the conversation a little bit.
My question goes way back to the beginning, back in his first chapter, or
Reshit?
first, no, first paragraph, where he talks about if you self-define as belonging to the people of Israel in whatever way, there's something familiar, meaning that makes you Jewish. And that's a little bit of a problem, because that kind of a self-definition is going to mean so many different things to different people. And it comes back to, how do you define yourself, or what is a Jew in the first place? And one thing that happens, I think, in today's world, if you're talking about less educated people, to say that you belong to the people of Israel, their thought, the outside world's first thought, is the state of Israel. And that brings in a whole bunch of, I can't think of a better word, garbage that doesn't really apply in this case.
Baggage.
Yes, baggage. Okay, so sort of spelled the same way, reverse that. But yeah. So I had a little problem with his self-definition being as simplistically stated as he did. But I understand that that is a basis for a lot of people's identification as Jewish.
Yeah, and what that means, I think, means different, like your self-identification, I think, means different things in the different worldviews. And I wonder if that's a question he's going to tackle in more depth in part 3.
When he talks about it.
So we might need to hold on to that. The parts about Israel we'll get to starting next week with part 2. But I wonder if he'll kind of come back, and if he doesn't, we might want to circle back to that question. We might want to circle back to that question towards the end if he hasn't tackled it. But I wanted to kind of throw out a question, something that I was wrestling with reading this, or that I was struggling with, is he largely defines in this chapter being Jewish as wrestling in some way with God, and in that struggle with God. My part of what I wrestle with is, I'm not sure how much people really want that wrestling, really want that struggle. They want clear, defined answers. And Judaism doesn't really offer clear, defined answers. It offers debate, conversation, wrestling. There's a teen that I've talked to a couple times who gets very frustrated, because he says, every time I ask a rabbi a question, they respond with a question, and they don't actually answer the question that I asked them. I'm like, I asked you a question, tell me what the answer is. And so, I'm curious how your response or your thoughts to that, of your value in the struggle, or whether your response to people's need for just a quick, clear answer.
I totally understand people's desire for a quick, clear answer. And what I would say to the young person that you were talking to is, find yourself a different rabbi. Because it appears to me, as somebody who enjoys the discussion part of it enjoys the analysis, the figuring it out, the discussing, the study part, it's perfect. But I understand, okay, Scott's upstairs, he's not going to hear this. Sometimes I feel like saying to him, don't give me the Scott Brandy answer, just say yes or no. Whereas everything is, goes into, and this is why, it's a long-winded explanation. intended to get me to the right place or to the place that he thinks is the answer. But sometimes what people want, what people need is the short answer. And I have experienced this myself. Once one of my kids said to an Orthodox rabbi, if we can't, and I was thinking of this before when it's you can't eat leg of lamb because of the struggle between Jacob and the man. But the question was, well, why then can we eat chicken thigh? And there are all kinds of answers to that Scott Brandy would have given you. However, the rabbi said, because God said so. But for some people, that's the right answer. For some people, that's the right answer. It wasn't for that kid, for my kid. It wasn't the right answer. But I think different people need different answers.
Lisa, you had your hand up, and then Barbara Royal will come back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Rabbi. I think there's more people in this world that want, as I said earlier, black and white answers. And I think hence like the political divide in this country. People want to believe that everything is all one way or all another way. And I think maybe that's why we are a small minority religion, albeit maybe passionate and mighty, but smaller in numbers, because there aren't as many of us who choose to engage in sort of like the constant struggle. And, I guess I even came to understand in this chapter that struggle also applies to traditional Jews. They just struggle over different things than I struggle over. So I think, we attract, but then by the same token, I think we attract people to Judaism who want that questioning, wrestling, struggling in their lives. So that's that's an open door for many people.
I'll say, my wife has said that, one of the challenges she has in the classroom sometimes is that she's trying to encourage her students to kind of think through the answer. And they're not really trained to do that. They're trained to say, hey, Alexa, what's the answer? I think she's been called more Alexa at least a couple of times. Yeah. Again, trying to think that on one hand, yes, it's good that we can attract the people who do want the conversation. But is that going to be sufficient? Is that sufficient to sustain us? Or are there going to be too many people who want just the quick, easy answer? And I had a teacher once who, if you ask, he used to be the head of the Orthodox Beit Din, the rabbinical court for the Orthodox Union. If you asked him a question, he'd say yes, or he'd say no. That was it. And if you say, how did you come up with that answer? Then he would go into the long explanation of, here's this source and this, and he'd give you all that. But if you just said, is this permitted or not? He'd say yes or no. And just, that was it. That was the quick answer. And if you wanted the explanation and the debate and the conversation, he'd tell you what it was. But Barbara Royal.
Just very quickly, following up on piggybacking on Lisa, for me, the tension, the argumentative felt more like people were providing options of ways to think that were permissible as a child. It just gave me options. And when people over the years question, why are you Jewish? I say, because there's so many options without judgment of what you can say and how you can say it, who you can, say it to, even your rabbi. So that was just a very important thing to me as to why I embraced my Judaism as an adult. And that's how I looked at it, not as arguing so much as everybody has options for you to think about. So maybe that'll be helpful.
Joshua?
Yeah, I think my thought was kind of along the lines of what you were saying. I think sometimes it's important, like other people saying, that there be options, but I think a lot of times people in Judaism are okay delegating their wrestling to somebody else. Like, you're okay saying, I want my rabbi to wrestle with this, but I really want to just be able to ask them, like, what should I do? Am I allowed to carry my cell phone on Shabbos? Am I allowed to take the bus on Shabbos? But you're okay. You want someone to be wrestling with God, but it doesn't have to be you all the time.
Troy, I thought I saw your hand up before too.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of along the struggle line and to circle back. You were saying other religions struggling, does that make them Jewish? Having grown up Christian, I would say a lot of people in the spaces, Christian spaces was in might have been struggling, but it's not accepted to voice those struggles. And there is more, at least in my experience, more black and white. This is what you should believe, and it's not as, I guess, the struggle's not as accepted, which is one of the things that attracted me to Judaism, is that that everyone here can openly say you might be struggling with a belief or with God in general, and there's not this black and white, I guess, idea. I feel like growing up, I was given direct answers like, yes, this is what you should believe or how things are. So.
Yeah, and to your answer, and Lisa, I think, alluded to it too, is speaking with the people interested in conversion over the years. That's one of the most common answers to why people are interested. Is the most people I've gotten is they've said, I grew up in a church of some sort, and wasn't really allowed to ask questions, wasn't really allowed to challenge. And, I have these questions, I have these things that I'm wrestling with, and I'm given two definitive answers that, this has to be the only way, and this is all it is. And I'm not sure about that. And what attracts them to Judaism is the fact that it's not always 100% clear, that there is debate, there is conversation, there is a sense of asking questions, a priority on asking questions and trying to come up with, what does God actually want from me in that moment. Esther?
Yeah, one of the things that I have appreciated about this book, and I think, maybe it's just a little bit of my own, I don't know, naivete, denial, that I always think of Judaism as the years go on diluted, like in Europe, they were more religious. They came here and, the Orthodox became conservative and the kids became Reform and their kids became nothing. Sorry about that. But, I think that what this book really gave me, in addition to, obviously the initial struggling with Jacob and God, is that there have always been, throughout history, traditionalists, progressives, non-believers. They have existed throughout the time, and we're still here, which I don't really understand that. I talk about a question and a struggle, and I had the same question that I think was brought up earlier. Who is a Jew? And especially, in the Reform movement now, if your father is a Jew and you're raised Jewish, you are legitimately considered a Jew. Well, that doesn't exactly fly in Israel. So despite, the differences that we may have. I think what the book, in addition to what people have said about non-judgment, there's a value in every single person who identifies and struggles with being Jewish. They're gosh, I lost my point, but anyways, that we will continue somehow, and that these questions are part of what makes us who we are, even for those. And I thought it was particularly interesting that those who don't believe in many ways struggle the most.
Yeah. Yes, I do think there's a sense that all of these always existed. And interestingly, as you were saying that, I was thinking back how Feldman kind of cites a Talmudic source for each of them. Right? He's able to quote a Talmudic text that kind of proves each of these approaches, which I think indicates a little bit of what you're saying, that the rabbis themselves kind of fell into these categories in some way, shape, or form, and wrestled with these same questions, just in a different way than we do. And that in itself is at least in a historical sense, we're not that different. More there's, as Kohelet says, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything that was will be again. And so it's changed, but the conversation has changed, but not entirely. The context in which we're having the conversation has changed, even if the conversation has not. Stuart?
Just sitting here listening to so many good thinkers and wonderful thoughts really gets me back to something we've discussed before, which is the whole issue of living with uncertainty. That's one of the things that a scientific approach to thinking about problems includes accepting the possibility that you don't know the exact answer, or if something is 95% likely to be the answer, it still leaves 5% possibility that that's not the right answer. But that's what you have to do. You have to deal with that and accept it. And so when you listen to very smart rabbis on both sides of an issue talking, and at the end, is there really an answer? I mean, you may choose to think that this rabbi is more correct in your way of thinking than this other one, but really it's just there's still a little uncertainty left, I think, in your mind about whether your option, whether what you're trying to believe in is the answer or not.
Humility is very much a Jewish value. Yes. TK?
I'm so glad you said that, Stuart. I think that's huge. I just listened to a physicist talk about the concept of randomness, and which is to me, is very closely tied with uncertainty, the uncertainty principle, the quantum physics and everything. And he described, he said, he was talking about ants as a way to understand that, and as a metaphor, and as a real manifestation of that. When ants have a food source, they form a straight line to that food source, and they leave, scent along the path so that everybody can follow it, and it's the most efficient way to get food back into the nest. And although none of the individual ants are, quote, intelligence, the whole community of ants acts as an intelligent being. And one of the things you will find when you've got a straight line like that is random ants, or ants not following that path, but going in their own direction randomly. And what happens is that if something happens, a human foot steps on that line, a tree falls on the line, something washes it away, the thing that saves the ants is that random element that was out there exploring past the ant that you see suddenly in your bathtub, and it's like, where the hell did you come from? Is a random ant, but their place in the whole structure is critical, and without it, everything fails. And I think they just announced that a discovery in the Large Hadron Collider that when matter and antimatter is created, one has a tendency for just a tiny amount of longer before it goes away. And that little tiny amount of difference is what causes us to have a universe that has matter as opposed to antimatter, and that exists at all. Because without it, everything would annihilate. If it was all equal, it would annihilate each other. And I'm sorry to ramble about that. I was so excited.
I think I followed the ants. I don't think I was smart enough to quite follow the second part, but that's okay.
Well, when matter is created out of the froth of quantum, it's created as either, think of it as not a positive and negative charge, but there's matter and then there's the opposite of it. And when those two things collide, they destroy each other. So in other words, the universe would have destroyed itself if not for the randomness of one type of matter existing for a millisecond longer. Sorry. And you could say that was God if you want to.
I really appreciate that. Not that I understand any of it. I have a nephew who's a quantum physicist, and but anyways, what I was going to say, and I don't understand the science of it, but I understand exactly what you were saying. There is some randomness that allows us to exist. There's something very freeing to me about that notion. For a person, and I think many of us are like this, who likes to have control over things. And we live now in a very scary world over which we don't have control over a lot of things in our lives. And even if it weren't a scary world, we never had control over a lot of things in our lives. For me, there's something comforting about knowing that random is random and I have no control. And so to angst over it, to worry about it, to try and figure out how I can control it or not control it, I just have to let it go and say, if I drop dead tomorrow, I drop dead tomorrow. I'm going to do whatever I need to do to be alive and to enjoy this moment today. To me, that's kind of what religion is about for me, and what Judaism is even about for me, is to really celebrate in the moments.
So before we go on to the next part of this book and go to part 2, which I anticipate will solicit a lot of dialogue and conversation. Was that nicely said? I'm curious, for those who want to share, you're not obligated, but for those who want to share, where you see your worldview falling. And I know Lisa said, she found hers in this last chapter. But anybody else who might want to share, which worldview do you find yourself in that, or at least saw the closest reflection of your worldview in his categories? Ellen?
I'm not sure this is on point, but one of the things that interested me, that made me think deeply, was how did my family
get where they were? And how did they do it so quickly? And what then were the effects on not a dictatorial father, but a father who did a lot of instruction? It was kind of subtle, but you knew you were learning something. In one generation, there was in middle Alabama a man with a pack on his back and nothing to eat but eggs for weeks. That was the first generation. His son comes over when he's 13 years old. He's been back in a little community. I don't think it was even, it was tiny, close to Vilna. But he comes to this country without the language, without a penny, with nothing but the possibility of walking around with this bag and selling tiny things that aren't worth much. The next generation, however, is this 13-year-old who has been bar mitzvah. So he was literate. He comes and he grows up as a teenager quickly and opens a store. And before you know it, he's married. He has a bigger store. He has a son. The son is getting the best education you could have gotten at that point in America by going there as a teenager, 13, about 15, to Harvard and Harvard Law. And there clearly wasn't a family discussion of where our Judaism and what our Judaism would be. But the core of it never disappeared. A lot of what I knew was very traditional, and I didn't realize it. But because this one man did not agree to the use of all this Hebrew in his rather rare occurrences in the synagogue, and because I've got, who did I know as a child? I've got letters I found, hands full of, from Felix Frankfurter on this idea of a kind of religion which is private, but it's really the state and the law that is important. My understanding of Alabama is kind of blurry because I've been in and out of it. And I guess reading this book has been a kind of transformation of understanding. Not that it was all strange, but that I didn't understand where it came from when. But it's been a real experience.
Thank God it has.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I'd much rather understand something than just go on living it without fully measuring it or examining it. I'm not smart enough to do either of those. Now, I don't have enough background, and I don't want to end my life the way my dad did with Alzheimer's. He was clear as can be that he didn't know exactly where he was going. And he also knew that he had only one large regret about his whole life, and that was that he did not go to Israel, which broke my heart because I had asked so many times. I could have gone with him any number of times. But it was only then that I think, even with all of the drawback and the mental deterioration, he understood what he had missed from a different angle. That's all.
Anyone else?
I mean, I can say I'm pretty firmly in the evolutionist camp in that one, which will probably surprise nobody.
Okay. Cindy?
But since you did share, Josh, I do have to ask. So, and I think for myself, where I am now, I haven't always been in this place, that it is a journey, and I sort of go back and forth between places. Do you mind sharing what brought you to, and maybe this is too personal and you don't have to say anything, but what brought you to this point, do you think?
Definitely, it's not too personal. I think to me, it is one, I think religion has, all right, let me, how to back this up. In my long personal struggle with God and like dealing with religion and working through skepticism and atheism and stuff, I think on the one hand, there's thinking that we are everything, which is sort of the atheist version. On the other hand, one of the main problems with religion that I see, and I got this from a Karen Armstrong book, was that it's very easy when you're religious to either sort of, or if you're thinking about God, to make God so distant that God is not relatable. And the other side is it's very easy to make God so personal that God becomes a reflection of whatever it is that you want. And I think what keeps me from being a true like progressive in that sense, like I truly like I believe women are equal and should have equal rights and responsibilities in life. But what keeps me out of the progressive camp of saying like that's self-evident is I am very leery of saying religion should say what I want, because people want all sorts of strange things, and that leads in weird directions that you love or hate, depending, because what is self-evident to me is not self-evident to somebody else. So if you want to make your God follow your self-evident morality, to me, that's not a firm enough foundation for something. So I really want to ground it in something beyond me. And if I can ground it in the idea that there's the Torah and scripture and halacha, but those have to evolve, and that evolution has to be in tension with like what people want and versus what our sources say, then I'm more comfortable with that than sort of saying it follows whatever I want has to be what is a religious imperative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that's really helpful to me, which is why I asked, because you sounded so certain when you answered. And yet I knew that there had to be, I mean, you're a very thoughtful person, that there had to be, a lot involved in whatever that surety is in this moment. So thank you. I appreciate that.
And to say sure means I'm sure that I'm in that sort of broad camp, but it doesn't, I don't think like any particular conclusions that come from that are sure. It's just like that's how I think about things.
Anybody else want to share? Barbara? You're muted.
Sorry. I think I have one foot in one camp, one foot in the other camp, one arm in one hand in a third camp, and one hand in a fourth camp. Because I think, or I know that at every step of the way, I have certain things that I share with each of them. And if you look at maybe the defining factor being, who have I paid donations and dues to? I hit 3 out of those 4. And here in Birmingham, I've hit 3 out of the 4. And maybe that's because number 3 doesn't exist in Birmingham. or they'd have gotten dues from me too.
Okay. Anyone else? Esther?
I appreciate that answer because I really think I still do think of it as a smorgasbord. But when I think about Josh's approach to his answer, how you think about religion, I think that I have to go with the progressive because that feels, I feel like I believe in some being. I'm uncertain what that is or what role that plays in my life. But I also value the messages. I believe that we are all God inspired, whatever God is. And those books, that Torah, is God inspired. Maybe man wrote it, maybe some other being wrote it, I don't know. But whatever it is, the messages and the meanings of those messages are, I think, what I believe in terms of my thinking about it.
So as we prepare to wrap up, I just kind of want to conclude with two thoughts. One is the image that I used a couple weeks ago of the lulav and etrog. That the rabbis have this idea that there are different kinds of Jews. Some have good deeds and Torah learning. Some only have one or the other. Some have neither. But on Sukkot, we bring them all together in an acknowledgement that the Jewish community really needs all of them in it. And in some sense, there are different worldviews of how do we view this. And coincidentally or not, he outlines 4 different options. We can debate about which one should be which option, but that's not really the point. I think the point is we do need all of them together for us to be the strongest Jewish community and Jewish people that we can. And so, as we talked about earlier, finding a way to appreciate and understand Jews who might practice and believe and act differently than us is part of the core of what I think Feldman is trying to argue. And I think central to what we as a Jewish people need to find a way to do is say we might disagree, we might not see things the same way, but you're still part of the people and we still love you as part of it. And secondly, he talks about the struggle and that as long as you're wrestling in the first place, that you're part of the Jewish people. And my general response to that is the quote from Pirkei Avot that according to the work is the reward. Mm-hmm. That the more you're willing to do the work, the more you're willing to wrestle, the more you're willing to ask questions, the more you're willing to struggle and fight and to understand yourself, to understand God, to understand your worldview, then the more you'll get out of the task that you're doing, and the more you'll get out of your spiritual life generally. So with that, we're going to go on to part 2 next week, and start talking about how, now that we've kind of identified these different worldviews, how does that play into the conversations around Israel, and how can that help inform our conversations around Israel? Yes, Barbara.
I'm sorry, this will take 1 minute. Can I just give a plug? This was unsolicited. She doesn't know anything about it, but most of you know that TK is a very justice-oriented person, writes great books. she has been volunteering for the Maranathan Academy for many years, teaching, I guess you would say, the most difficult kids who were no longer thought to be even capable of staying in school or graduating. And they are having a fundraiser. I've contributed in her honor, but I've never seen a fundraiser. And I wondered if TK had even sent you what I got, which was an announcement of this music concert in their honor of Maranathan Academy at Red Mountain Theater. And if she hasn't, I wondered if maybe we could pass that along, TK.
Of course. Thank you so much, Barbara. And no, I haven't sent it to the group. Would that be all right?
Yep.
You can
Yeah,
look
yeah,
at it, and even if you just read it and get familiar with what the school is doing, that would be great. Thank you.
you're
So
Thank you,
everybody, be well, take care of yourselves, have a good week, and look forward to learning with you again soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take care, everyone.